When she turned 18 and inherited a worthless property, she thought it was the final joke in a life of institutional care. But what she found behind a hidden wall would unravel a secret sacrifice decades in the making. If you've ever felt like the world had already decided who you were, or that you were completely on your own, stick with me through this. My name is Alara, and this is the story of how I found out my entire life was built on a lie designed to protect me. Subscribe, and let's get into it. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to be a problem for the state of New York. There was no party, no cake, just a thin manila folder on the desk of Mrs. Gable, the director of the Northwood Group Home, and the faint, persistent smell of industrial disinfectant that clung to everything in that building. It was the smell of my childhood. For 2 years, since my grandmother Maeve had died, Northwood had been my home. Before that, it was just me and Maeve. And before that? Well, before that is a blur of social workers and temporary placements I try not to think about. Mrs. Gable slid the folder across the scratched laminate. Happy birthday, Alara. As of 9:03 this morning, you are officially an adult. Congratulations. Her voice was flat, the same tone she used to announce dinner was ready or that someone's weekend visit was canceled. Inside the folder was my birth certificate, my social security card, and a check for $147.53, the balance of my state-managed savings account. It was my severance package from the system. There's also this, she said, pulling a separate, crisp white envelope from a drawer. It was addressed to me, care of the home. The return address was a law firm downtown, Davies, Finch & Associates. It came yesterday. We held it for you. Legally, we couldn't give it to you before today. I stared at the embossed lettering. Lawyers meant trouble. In my world, they never brought good news. They were the people who explained why you had to move again, why your family couldn't see you, why things were the way they were. What is it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It's from your grandmother's estate, she said, already turning back to her computer, her duty of care expiring with each tick of the clock. You should call them. The number's on the envelope. My grandmother's estate. The word sounded grand, important, but I knew better. Maeve and I had lived on her Social Security checks in a tiny second-floor apartment. Her prized possessions were a collection of chipped teacups and a worn-out armchair that sighed every time she sat in it. There was no estate. There was just debt and the lingering scent of lavender and mothballs. I clutched the envelope. It felt cold, formal. It felt like the final, definitive proof that she was gone. The walk away from Northwood was shorter than I expected. I'd spent 2 years dreaming of it, of walking out that door and never looking back. But when I did, with a single duffel bag over my shoulder and 2 envelopes in my hand, the world didn't feel bigger. It felt terrifyingly empty. The city noise was a roar. The people on the sidewalk moved with a purpose I couldn't comprehend. I was a ghost, haunting my own life. I found a bench in a small, neglected park and opened the lawyer's letter. The language was dense, full of words like heretofore and bequeathed. I had to read it 3 times to understand. My grandmother, Maeve O'Connell, had left me her sole asset, a property. An address was listed, one I didn't recognize. It was far north, almost to the Canadian border, in a town I'd never even heard of. The letter requested I make an appointment with a Mr. Davies to discuss the disposition of the asset. A flicker of something, not quite hope, but a less numb version of despair, stirred in my chest. A property? A house? A piece of land? Maybe Maeve had a secret. Maybe she wasn't as poor as I'd thought. Maybe this was it, the lifeline I didn't even know I was praying for. A place to go, a place that was mine. The next morning I called the number. The receptionist was brisk. Mr. Davies could see me at 4 p.m. The law office was in one of those old downtown buildings with a gilded lobby and a slow, rattling elevator. It was meant to project wealth and stability, but it just made me feel smaller. Mr. Davies's office was cluttered. Towers of files leaned like ancient trees, and the air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. He was a man in his late 50s with a kind, tired face and a tie that was slightly askew. He shook my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Elara, I'm Robert Davies. I was your grandmother's lawyer, for a brief time." He gestured for me to sit. "I'll be direct," he began, pulling a thin file from a teetering stack. "Your grandmother engaged my services about 3 years ago, shortly after her diagnosis. She wanted to ensure her affairs were in order. The centerpiece of those affairs is a property, a small farmhouse and 5 acres of land in St. Lawrence County. It was her family's home, where she grew up." My heart hammered against my ribs. A farmhouse, 5 acres. It was more than I could have dreamed of. A real home. "Now," he continued, his tone shifting, becoming more cautious, "I need to manage your expectations. The property it's not in good condition. It's been unoccupied for the better part of 30 years. The roof is compromised, there's significant water damage, and the structure itself is likely unsound." He slid a few grainy photographs across the desk. They showed a collapsed porch, boarded up windows, and siding that was peeling away from the frame like sunburnt skin. The whole house seemed to be sagging into the earth. "Furthermore," he said, tapping a document, "there are significant back taxes owed to the county, about $8,000. Your grandmother was unable to keep up with them in her final years." He let that sink in. The flicker of hope in my chest sputtered and died. Of course, there was always a catch. "The county will likely seize the property and auction it off within the next 6 months if the debt isn't settled." I felt the familiar cold dread creep up my spine, the feeling of being trapped. "So it's worthless," I said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Davies gave me a sympathetic look. "From a practical standpoint, yes. The cost to repair it would be astronomical, far exceeding its market value. And with the tax lien, I'm sorry." He paused, then pushed another document toward me. "However, there is one small silver lining. We've received an offer." He explained that a development company, Vantage Corporation, had been buying up land in that area. They were offering to buy the property as is. Their offer was for $10,000. "It's not much," he said, "but it would cover the back taxes, my firm's fees for handling the transaction, and leave you with a small amount, about $1,500. $1,500. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place. It was a bus ticket to somewhere else, a deposit on a cheap apartment, a chance to start over without the shadow of an $8,000 debt hanging over me. It was the sensible choice, the only choice. "They just want the land, I assume?" I asked. "Correct. They'll demolish the structure. They've made similar offers to all the landowners in that parcel." Mr. Davies leaned forward. "Elara, I know this is disappointing, but your grandmother, I think she knew this was the likely outcome. In my opinion, this offer is the best you can hope for, a clean break, a little cash to help you get on your feet." He was right. Everything he said made perfect sense. I was an 18-year-old with $147 and a duffel bag. I couldn't fight a tax lien or rebuild a ruined house. Taking the offer was logical, but something in me resisted. It was Maeve's home, her family's home. Selling it to be demolished felt like a betrayal. It felt like burying her all over again. "Why did she keep it?" I asked, looking at the photos of the decaying house. "If it was just falling apart, why pay taxes on it for all those years?" Mr. Davies shrugged, a gesture of weary resignation. "Sentiment, I suppose. People hold on to things. It doesn't always make financial sense." He slid a pen and the contract toward me. "You don't have to decide now, but the offer is time-sensitive. Vantage wants to close quickly." I looked from the contract to the photo of the house. It was ugly, broken, forgotten, a lot like how I felt. And for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to sign its death warrant. Not yet. "I want to see it," I said. Mr. Davies looked surprised. See it? Elara, it's a 6-hour bus ride. There's nothing there. The town is barely a crossroads. The house isn't safe to enter. I don't care, I said, a stubbornness I didn't know I possessed rising in my throat. It was hers. I need to see it before I let them tear it down. He sighed, the sound of a man who had given this kind of advice 100 times and been ignored 101. All right, it's your right, of course. The key is with a neighbor, a Mr. Henderson. His address is in the file, but I advise you to be careful, and I advise you to reconsider the offer. I walked out of his office with the file in my hands, the contract unsigned. The $1,500 felt like a bribe to forget, to walk away without asking any more questions. And that was the one thing I couldn't do. I spent $70 of my precious savings on a one-way bus ticket north. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I was just looking for a reason to feel like Maeve hadn't left me with nothing but a pile of debt and a final, bitter disappointment. I had to believe there was more to the story. I had to. The bus ride was a slow, rattling journey out of the life I knew. The concrete and steel of the city bled into the manicured lawns of the suburbs, which in turn dissolved into sprawling farmland. As we pushed further north, the landscape grew wilder, more rugged. The trees grew taller, the hills steeper. The sky seemed to get bigger, a vast, pale canvas of gray. It was late autumn, and the world outside my window looked brittle and tired, stripped down to its bones. It matched my mood perfectly. I clutched the file Mr. Davies had given me, rereading the few pages it contained. The deed, dated 1928. The tax notices, each one more urgent than the last. And the offer from Vantage Corporation, so clean and clinical. It felt like I was holding the entire history of my family's decline in one thin folder. Hours bled into one another. I watched small towns flash by, their main streets lined with tired-looking storefronts and American flags. I tried to imagine Maeve growing up in a place like this, so far from the city bustle where I had always known her. It was like trying to imagine a different person. The woman who taught me to read, who made me cinnamon toast when I was sad, who hummed old songs while she washed dishes. What did she have to do with this stark, empty land? The bus finally hissed to a stop in a town called Oakhaven. It wasn't so much a town as a punctuation mark on a long, empty road. A gas station, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a post office, and a handful of houses. This was it, the end of the line. The air that hit me when I stepped off the bus was so cold it felt solid. It smelled of pine needles and damp earth and snow that was waiting just over the horizon. It was a clean, sharp smell, so different from the city's exhaust-choked air. Following the crude map I'd drawn based on Mr. Davies's instructions, I found the Henderson place. It was a neat, well-kept trailer with a profusion of plastic lawn ornaments. A man with a face like a wizened apple answered the door. He introduced himself as Bill Henderson. "You must be Maeve's girl," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you were coming. Davies's office called." He looked me up and down, taking in my thin city jacket and worn-out sneakers. "Not much to see up there." "I know," I said. I had to." He nodded slowly, as if he understood something I didn't. He disappeared back into his trailer and returned with a single, rusty iron key on a piece of twine. "It's been sitting in my drawer for 20 years, he said, dropping it into my palm. It was heavy, real. Maeve's mother gave it to my father, told him to hold it in case anyone ever came back. He pointed down the road. "It's another mile that way. You can't miss it. It's the last house on the road before it turns to dirt." He hesitated. "Watch your step on the porch, and don't expect the lights to work." The walk was cold. The wind cut through my jacket, and the silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of my own footsteps on the gravel shoulder. And then I saw it. The house sat back from the road, half swallowed by overgrown trees and thorny bushes. It was even worse than the pictures. It looked less like a house, and more like something the earth was slowly reclaiming. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old back, the porch tilted at a drunken angle, and the paint was all but gone, leaving the wood beneath a ghostly gray. It was a skeleton, a monument to decay. My heart sank. Mr. Davies was right. This was a ruin. A worthless, heartbreaking ruin. I pushed my way through the tangled yard, the branches catching at my clothes. The front steps groaned under my weight, and I tread carefully, just as Mr. Henderson had warned. The big iron key slid into the lock with a grating sound. It took both my hands and all my strength to turn it. The lock gave way with a loud, echoing crack, and the door swung inward on a single protesting hinge, opening into a wall of darkness. The air that rolled out was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time, of dust and rot and forgotten things. I stood on the threshold, my breath pluming in the cold air, a feeling of profound sadness washing over me. This wasn't a home, it was a grave. Stepping inside felt like trespassing. My eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, aided by the weak gray light filtering through the grimy, boarded-up windows. The furniture was still there, shrouded in white cloths like a room full of ghosts. I could make out the shape of a sofa, a table, chairs. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform layer of dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like macabre chandeliers. I ran my finger along the back of a chair, leaving a clean streak in the grime. Underneath, the wood was dark and solid. I moved through the downstairs rooms like a sleepwalker. The living room, the dining room, a small kitchen at the back of the house. In the kitchen, the linoleum was curled and cracked, and a calendar on the wall was turned to October, 1988. It felt like a crime scene where the only victim was time itself. I thought of Maeve, of the stories she'd told me. She'd never talked about this place, not once. She'd always said her family was gone, that the past was the past. Why had she held on to this wreck? Why had she let it die? Upstairs was more of the same. 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub stained with rust. In one of the bedrooms, a small rocking horse stood in the corner, its paint faded, one of its rockers broken. Was this her room? I touched its wooden head, and for a second, I could almost hear the echo of a child's laughter. The sadness was so thick I could barely breathe. This whole trip was a mistake. I should have signed the papers, taken the money, and run. There was nothing for me here but ghosts and regret. I was about to give up, to turn around and walk back out into the cold, when I saw it. I was in the pantry, a small, narrow room off the kitchen. It was lined with empty shelves. The air was colder in here, and there was a faint, damp smell. Most of the walls were exposed lath and crumbling plaster, but one section on the back wall was different. It was a smooth, rectangular patch of plaster, about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. It was a slightly different color than the rest of the wall, a cleaner, paler gray. It looked newer, out of place. My curiosity piqued. I ran my hand over it. It was cold and solid. But as I traced its edges, my fingers found a tiny crack, a hairline fracture in the smooth surface. Using the edge of the old iron key, I scraped at the crack. A small chip of plaster fell away, revealing not more plaster, not lath, but dark, solid wood underneath. My breath caught. It wasn't a patch. It was a seal. I worked faster, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I scraped and picked and clawed at the plaster, the dust falling like snow onto the floor. It took me almost an hour, my fingers raw and numb from the cold, but finally I had cleared the edges. It was a door, a small, simple plank door, with no handle and no hinges visible. It had been plastered over, hidden from view. Why would someone hide a door? My mind raced. This wasn't part of a normal house. This was a secret. I searched for a way to open it. The edges were flush with the frame. There was no purchase. In my frustration, I pushed against it. The door didn't budge. I pushed again, harder, putting my shoulder into it. There was a low groan of stressed wood, and then, with a sudden splintering crack, the bottom of the door swung inward. It hadn't been hinged on the side, but at the top. It was a hatch designed to lift up and in. I knelt, peering into the darkness beyond. The air that flowed out was even colder, drier. It smelled of stone and old paper. Using the flashlight on my phone, I shined a beam into the space. It was a small, closet-sized room, barely deep enough to stand in. The walls were rough stone, and it was completely empty. Except for one thing. On a low stone shelf at the back sat a single, dark green metal box, the kind soldiers use for ammunition. It was closed with two heavy latches. My hands were shaking as I crawled into the small, hidden space. The box was heavy. I dragged it out of the wall and into the dim light of the kitchen. It wasn't locked. With trembling fingers, I flipped the latches. They sprang open with a loud metallic snap. I lifted the lid. For a moment, I just stared, unable to process what I was seeing. The box was filled with money. Stacks and stacks of cash, bundled in paper bands, $100 bills. It looked like more money than I had ever imagined existed. And on top of the money sat a thick, cream-colored envelope. In a familiar, elegant script, my name was written on the front, Ilara. I sank to the dusty floor, the cold seeping through my jeans, and picked up the envelope. My hands trembled so badly I could barely open it. Inside were several pages, filled with my grandmother's handwriting. I took a deep, shaky breath and began to read. "My dearest Ilara," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means several things. It means I am gone. It means you have turned 18, and it means you were stubborn enough and curious enough to come all the way up here and not just sign the papers. I was counting on that. I was counting on you." I had to stop and wipe the tears from my eyes before I could continue. "I imagine you are sitting in a cold, dark, ruined house, wondering what on earth I was thinking. You have probably been told this place is worthless, a liability. I need you to know that every broken window, every peeling board, every inch of decay was deliberate. It was my life's work. It was for you. 35 years ago, a company called Vantage Corporation came to this valley. They knew, through geological surveys they kept secret, that there was a rich vein of lithium running directly under this land, under our farm. It wasn't valuable then, but they knew it would be one day. Your grandfather, my husband, found out. He tried to warn our neighbors, to organize them. For his trouble, Vantage ruined him. They used legal tricks and financial pressure, bought up his debts, and drove him into the ground. He died of a heart attack at 49, a broken man. They thought I, a grieving widow with a young child, your mother, would be easy to push out. They offered me pennies for this land. I refused. I knew I could never fight them in court. They had armies of lawyers. So I came up with a different plan, a long plan. I couldn't make the land look valuable, so I had to make it look worthless. I moved away. I stopped all upkeep. I let the taxes fall behind, just enough to be a threat, but I always paid just before the final foreclosure, draining my savings to do it. I let the house rot. I made it an eyesore, a liability, a place no one would want. I made myself a poor old woman with nothing to her name. It was a performance, Ilara, a long, lonely, exhausting performance, all to keep their eyes off the real prize, to wait for a time when the fight could be won, to wait for you. The money in this box is everything I saved over 30 years. It's not a fortune, but it should be close to $50,000. It is your seed. It is your armor. You can take it and walk away. I would not blame you. You deserve an easy life after the one you've had. But if you have any of my stubborn blood in you, you will not walk away. You will fight. This house, this land, it isn't a ruin. It's a treasure chest, and you are the key." I let the pages fall into my lap. The dusty kitchen seemed to spin around me. $50,000. A hidden mineral deposit. A 30-year-long secret war waged by my grandmother. The woman I knew, the quiet, gentle woman who lived in a small apartment, was a warrior. She hadn't abandoned this place. She had been guarding it. The poverty, the struggle, the slow decline. It wasn't a failure. It was a strategy. It was a shield. I cried. I cried for the grandmother I never truly knew. I cried for the years of sacrifice she endured, all alone. I cried for her husband, my grandfather, a man I'd never met, who died fighting for this place. And I cried for the little girl inside me, who had always felt abandoned, left behind, worthless. It wasn't true. None of it was true. I hadn't been abandoned. I had been protected. My entire life, I had been the subject of the most elaborate, patient, and heartbreaking act of love I could possibly imagine. The weight of it was crushing, but it was also liberating. The story of my life wasn't one of neglect. It was one of inheritance. Not just of land, but of a fight. Okay, I need to pause here for a second. If you've made it this far, thank you. This was the moment my entire world tilted on its axis. Have you ever had a moment like that? A piece of information that doesn't just change your future, but completely rewrites your past? It's a feeling that's hard to describe, like you're suddenly a stranger in your own history. If this is resonating with you, if you've ever had to relearn your own story, let me know in the comments. This channel is for people who understand that life is more complicated than it looks on the surface. We are a community built on those hidden truths. Your story matters. Now, let's get back to what happened in that cold, dusty kitchen. I sat there on the floor for what felt like hours, the letter in one hand, a stack of $100 bills in the other. The money didn't feel real. It felt like stage props from Maeve's long performance. The cold from the floorboards had seeped deep into my bones, but I barely noticed. My mind was a storm of grief and anger and a fierce, burning love for the grandmother who had played the long game for me. Mr. Davies' words echoed in my head. A clean break, a little cash to help you get on your feet. He had no idea. Vantage Corporation had no idea. They all saw a scared, broke 18-year-old. They were about to find out they were wrong. Maeve had been counting on it. Her letter wasn't finished. I picked up the last page. This is not all, Ilara. Hiding the house was only the first step. Your grandfather was a meticulous man. He didn't just have suspicions. He had proof. He knew that fighting a corporation like Vantage required more than just a claim. It required evidence they couldn't bury. Before he died, he gathered it. Correspondence, internal memos he was leaked, his own geological test results that confirmed the lithium deposit. They searched this house after he died. They tore floorboards up. But they never found it. Because he was smarter than them. And I was too. In my bedroom upstairs, the one with the window that looks out over the old oak tree, there is a fireplace. The hearth is made of fieldstone. One of those stones is loose. The third from the left, on the bottom row. Pry it up. What you need is under there. It is your sword and your shield. There is also the name of a lawyer in there. Not Davies. He is a good man, but he is a small-town lawyer, good for wills and property sales. He is not a fighter. The name I have left you is for a fighter. Her name is Anya Albright. She was a young environmental lawyer back then, and your grandfather gave her some pro bono help on a case that made her career. She owes him. Tell her you are Michael O'Connell's granddaughter. Tell her you have his legacy. She will know what it means. This is your choice, my love. Walk away with the money and build a life for yourself. You have earned it. Or stay and fight for the legacy that is rightfully yours. It will be hard. They will be ruthless. But you are an O'Connell. We do not break easily. Whatever you choose, know that I love you more than words can say. Know that my entire life, after I lost everyone else, was for you. Be brave. Your loving grandmother, Maeve. I folded the letter, my hands steady now. The choice she offered wasn't a choice at all. Not for me. Not anymore. How could I take her sacrifice and turn it into a down payment on an apartment? How could I let Vantage win after she had given her entire life to make sure they wouldn't? The fear I had felt earlier was gone, burned away by a cold, clear rage. I got to my feet, my joints aching from the cold. I carefully packed the money back into the ammo box and pushed it deep into the hidden compartment. covering the opening with the broken door. It would be safe there. Then I went upstairs. Maeve's bedroom was just as she'd described. A large window looked out on the gnarled branches of a massive ancient oak, and in the corner, a stone fireplace, dark with soot. I knelt before it, my phone's flashlight beam dancing over the rough-hewn stones of the hearth. Third from the left, bottom row. I found it. It looked no different from the others, but when I pushed my fingers into the grout line and pulled, it shifted. It was heavy, but I managed to work it loose, prying it up with the end of the rusty iron key. Beneath it was a small, hollowed-out cavity, and inside that cavity was another box. This one was a small, tin recipe box, rusted at the edges. My heart hammered as I lifted it out. Inside, there was no money. There was something far more valuable. It was a stack of papers, yellowed and brittle with age, wrapped in oilcloth. I carefully unwrapped them. There were letters on Vantage Corporation letterhead, talking about the O'Connell problem and the strategy to acquire the parcel through financial attrition. There were geological charts with handwritten notes from my grandfather in the margins. And there was a sworn affidavit from a former Vantage employee, detailing the company's knowledge of the lithium deposit and their deliberate campaign to suppress that information and acquire the land cheaply. It was a smoking gun, a whole arsenal of them. Beneath the papers was a small, folded note. On it was a name and a number. Anya Albright, with a New York City phone number. This was it. This was everything. My grandfather's evidence and my grandmother's patience combined into a weapon she had just handed to me. I sat on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom, the dusty air thick with the ghosts of the past, and I felt their presence. I felt their fight, and I knew I was not alone. The next 24 hours were a blur of calculated action. My first priority was security. I couldn't stay in the house. It was too exposed, and I couldn't go back to the city with this evidence. I needed a neutral, anonymous space. I walked the mile back to town, my mind working faster than it ever had before. At the gas station, I bought a cheap burner phone and a coffee. The warmth of the cup felt good in my numb hands. Then I walked to the diner and ordered a plate of pancakes I barely touched, using their Wi-Fi to book a room in a cheap motel in the next town over, paying in cash from a $100 bill I'd taken from the box. I went back to the house one last time. I took the tin box of evidence and a few $1,000s from the ammo can, stuffing them into my duffel bag. Then I carefully replaced the hearthstone and resealed the hidden door in the pantry as best I could, using some old plaster I found in the cellar to cover the seams. It wouldn't hold up to close inspection, but it would pass a casual glance. I locked the front door behind me, the heavy iron key feeling like a scepter in my hand. I dropped it back off with Mr. Henderson, telling him I'd be in touch and thanking him for his help. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. "You take care, girl," was all he said. From the motel room, which smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach, I made the call. I dialed the number for Anya Albright, my hand shaking slightly. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Albright & Associates?" "I need to speak with Miss Albright," I said, my voice sounding thin and young to my own ears. "It's a personal matter." "I'm sorry, Miss Albright does not take unscheduled calls. If you'd like to leave a message..." "Tell her it's about Michael O'Connell," I interrupted, the words Maeve had written burning in my mind. "Tell her I have his legacy." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of typing. "One moment," the voice said, suddenly less dismissive. I was on hold for what felt like an eternity. I stared at the stained popcorn ceiling of the motel room, my heart pounding. What if Maeve was wrong? What if 30 years was too long for a debt to be remembered? Then a new voice came on the line. It was sharp, clear, and radiated an energy you could feel even through the phone. "This is Anya Albright. Who is this?" "My name is Alara O'Connell," I said, taking a breath. "Michael O'Connell was my grandfather." There was another silence, but this one was different. It was weighted, thoughtful. "Michael O'Connell," she said, her voice softer now. "He was a good man, a brilliant geologist. What they did to him was a crime. I haven't heard that name in 30 years. What do you mean you have his legacy?" I have his papers, I said. The geological surveys, the letters from Vantage, the affidavit. My grandmother, Maeve, she kept them. She hid them, she left them for me. The silence on the other end was absolute. I could almost feel her mind working, connecting dots across 3 decades. Where are you? She asked, her voice all business now. In a motel near Oakhaven. Stay there. Don't talk to anyone. Don't use your real name. I have a junior associate in Albany. He can be there in 3 hours. He will drive you to New York. Bring everything you have. Do you understand? Yes, I said, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washing over me. I understand. Ilara, she said, just before she hung up, your grandfather was one of the bravest men I ever met. And your grandmother, to do what she did. You come from strong stock. We're going to make them pay. The line went dead. I sat on the edge of the lumpy motel bed and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for my entire life. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time, I wasn't fighting alone. I had my grandfather's proof, my grandmother's patience, and now I had a warrior on my side. Vantage Corporation thought they were buying a worthless piece of land from a broke orphan. They had no idea they were walking into a 30-year-old trap, and that I was the one who was about to spring it. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal strategy and quiet patience. Anya Albright was everything my grandmother had promised. She was a force of nature, a brilliant legal mind with a core of steel. When I met her in her sleek Manhattan office, she looked at me not as a child, but as a client, a partner. She listened to my story, examined the evidence from the tin box with an almost reverent intensity, and then laid out a plan. We wouldn't just sue for the value of the land. We would go after Vantage for fraud, for racketeering, for the deliberate financial ruin of my grandfather. We would make it a legacy case. The $50,000 my grandmother had saved became our war chest, paying for expert witnesses and filing fees. I didn't go back to the city. At Anya's suggestion, I stayed upstate, living in a small rented room in a town a few miles from Oakhaven. It was quiet, anonymous. It gave me space to breathe, to process the seismic shifts in my own history. I spent my days in the local library, reading everything I could about property law, geology, and corporate litigation. I was no longer just a victim of circumstance. I was an active participant in my own fight for justice. Anya's team communicated with me daily, sending me documents to review, asking me questions about my grandfather, my grandmother, the house. Vantage Corporation's initial response was predictable. Their lawyers were dismissive, arrogant. They sent a lowball settlement offer, a nuisance payment to make us go away. Anya sent it back with a one-word reply, no. When we filed the full lawsuit, with all of my grandfather's meticulously gathered evidence attached, their tone changed. The arrogance was replaced by a frantic, aggressive defense. They tried to paint my grandfather as a failed farmer, my grandmother as a delusional old woman, and me as a greedy opportunist. It was ugly. But Anya had warned me it would be. They're cornered, she told me during one of our late-night calls. They know what that evidence means in a courtroom. They're just trying to scare you into folding. I didn't fold. Every time their lawyers tried to smear my family's name, I thought of Maeve, alone for all those years, tending to her secret. I thought of the rocking horse in the upstairs bedroom, of the calendar stuck on 1988. I wasn't just fighting for money or land. I was fighting for their story. I was taking back the narrative. During this time, I started going back to the house. Not to live, not yet, but to work. With a small portion of the money Maeve had left, I bought supplies. I started with the simple things. I cleared the overgrown yard, cutting back the thorny bushes that had swallowed the house. I replaced the broken panes of glass in the windows, letting light into the dusty rooms for the first time in decades. I repaired the front steps and patched the worst of the holes in the roof. It was slow, hard work. My hands were often sore, my muscles aching. But every board I nailed, every window I glazed, felt like an act of defiance. I was reversing the decay. I was healing the wounds my grandmother had been forced to inflict on her own home. The house began to change. It started to breathe again. The air inside lost some of its musty staleness, replaced by the smell of fresh-cut wood and clean air. It was still a long way from being a home, but it was no longer just a ruin. It was a project. It was a promise. The locals started to notice. Mr. Henderson would sometimes drive by slowly, giving me a quiet nod. The woman at the general store started calling me by name, asking me how the work was coming. They had all seen the house as a lost cause, an eyesore. Now they saw life happening there. They saw someone choosing to stay, to invest, to care. I wasn't just Maeve's ghost anymore. I was becoming part of the place. One afternoon, while I was sanding the old front door, Mr. Henderson pulled into the driveway. He got out of his truck and walked over, looking at the house. "It's starting to look like itself again," he said, his voice quiet. "Your grandmother would be proud." "I hope so," I said. He looked at me, his eyes kind. "We all knew what that Vantage Company was," he said. "We just didn't have the stomach to fight 'em. Not after what happened to your granddad. We took their cheap offers and looked the other way. I'm glad someone finally had the guts to stand up." It was the first time anyone had spoken of it directly. It was an apology and a blessing all in one. In that moment, I felt a sense of belonging that I had never known. This wasn't just my fight. It was the town's fight, too. I was just the one who had finally picked up the sword. The legal battle raged for nearly a year. As the discovery phase deepened, Vantage's position crumbled. Anya's team uncovered a pattern of similar behavior in other states, a corporate strategy of predatory acquisition. The affidavit from my grandfather's source was corroborated by other former employees who, inspired by our lawsuit, came forward. The story began to leak to the press. "The Lyeth Corporation sued by granddaughter of man they ruined," one headline read. The narrative was powerful, a classic David and Goliath tale. Vantage's stock began to dip. Their board grew nervous. Finally, they blinked. Anya called me one evening. "They want to settle," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. "They're terrified of this going to a jury." The settlement they offered wasn't just a nuisance payment, it was a surrender. They offered to pay the full, independently assessed value of the mineral rights, which was in the millions. They offered to pay punitive damages for the fraud, and a separate sum to establish a community fund in Oakhaven as a gesture of goodwill. They also agreed to a public apology to the O'Connell family and to have the court records unsealed. It was more than we could have ever hoped for in a verdict. It was total victory. "It's your decision, Alara," Anya said. "We can take the settlement, or we can take them to court and destroy them. But the settlement gives you everything you need to build your future." I thought about it for a long time. My first instinct was to crush them, to see them pay for every bit of pain they had caused. But then I thought of Maeve. Her goal was never pure revenge. It was justice. It was about securing a future for me and reclaiming her family's name. The settlement did that. It was the end of the war. "We take the settlement," I said. The day the papers were signed, I felt not elation, but a profound, quiet peace. It was over. The long 30-year battle was finally won. The first thing I did was pay the back taxes on the property. I walked into the county clerk's office, and with a check from the settlement, I cleared the debt that had haunted my grandmother for decades. The clerk stamped the document, paid in full, and I felt a generational weight lift from my shoulders. Now I am writing this from the house, my house. It's still a work in progress. The living room is filled with new drywall, and the kitchen is waiting for cabinets. But it's warm, it's bright, it is a home, filled not with ghosts, but with promise. I established a trust to manage the mineral rights, ensuring the land is developed responsibly, with a portion of the profits going directly back into the community, just as my grandfather would have wanted. I am no longer the girl who aged out of the system with nothing. I am the guardian of a legacy. This house is more than just wood and nails to me. It is a testament to the fierce, stubborn love of a grandmother who refused to be broken. It is a symbol of the fact that things are not always what they seem. A worthless property can be a hidden treasure. An act of abandonment can be an act of protection. A story of loss can become a story of victory. My grandmother taught me that the greatest strength is often quiet, patient, and underestimated. She played the long game, and because of her, I have a future she could only dream of. I am home. This whole journey started with a lie, the lie that this place was worthless, but it led me to the deepest truth of my life, the truth that I was loved, that I was worthy, and that I was never, ever alone. And that's a lesson that is worth more than any mineral deposit, more than any settlement. So, I want to end by asking you this. What in your life have you been told is worthless? What have you been told to give up on? Maybe it's a dream, a relationship, or a part of yourself. My story is proof that sometimes the things that look the most broken are just waiting for someone to see their true value. They are waiting for someone stubborn enough and curious enough to look behind the wall. If my story has meant something to you, please subscribe to the channel. This is a place for stories like ours. And in the comments below, I want you to share one thing you've refused to give up on. Let's fill this space with stories of resilience. I promise I will read every single one. Thank you for listening, and remember, be brave.